What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen shocks Alireza Firouza with an insane attacking game in the Najdorf Sicilian. Now, of course, the Najdorf occurs after the moves e4, c5, knight f3, d6, then d4, the open Sicilian, and finally c takes, knight f6, knight c3, and then a6. This, of course, is the key Najdorf move, and now here, Magnus Carlsen plays literally everything against the Najdorf, but in this game, Magnus busts out the most disrespectful move there is in this position, and that is the move Rook to g1. Bang! What is Magnus Carlsen's idea? It is simple. He just wants to go g4, g5, knock off that knight off the f6 square, and then checkmate black. Now, of course, Alireza Firouza is going to have a say in this. In the game, he plays h5, trying to stop the g4 idea from white, but Magnus Carlsen, he regroups and finds an unbelievable attacking idea, and I promise you, you are going to be shocked by Magnus Carlsen's attacking chess in this game. Alright, here in this position, black's idea of h5 does have the advantage of stopping g4 from white, but of course it weakens the king side considerably. Black's king is always going to be less safe on the king side now, and beyond that, it also weakens the g5 square, and for that reason, Magnus Carlsen switches things up. He immediately goes for the move bishop g5, capitalizing on this weak g5 square. Now, of course, if that pawn was still on h7, then h6 would be possible, knocking off the bishop, but here, that is simply not an option, so Magnus Carlsen playing a bishop g5 Najdorf, except black also has the move h5, and white also has the move rook to g1. Now, who does this benefit? Honestly, it's anyone's guess. Let's see what happens here in the game. Now black, knight d7, interesting choice. It is a viable option versus bishop g5 in the Najdorf. And of course, black's main ideas are to follow up with e6 at some point, perhaps b5, bishop b7, and trying to get counterplay going on the queen side as fast as possible. Now, of course, on move 7, there were other options for black besides knight d7. Real fast, if you're a Najdorf player, the best move here is perhaps the move b5, trying to get counterplay going on the queen side as fast as possible. Now, this looks scary because white has the idea bishop takes f6, but it turns out that is not something you have to worry about. Here after g takes, black is actually doing fine, as this move rook g1 doesn't make a whole lot of sense in this structure. Now, instead of bishop takes f6, the best move for white here is going to be a4. Once again, black is going to be perfectly fine. You just go b4, then after knight d5, this pawn on the e4 square hangs. Knight takes e4 is the move. And from here, things are really crazy, but black seems to be doing okay. So overall, b5, probably the best move, but here Alireza, he decides to do something different. Instead, knight d7 on the board. Now Magnus, in the spirit of the bishop g5 variation against the Najdorf, he goes bishop c4, which, again, there is a very common idea. Of course, once again, there were alternatives. The most standard plan here would have been queen d2 followed by long castles, but once again, Magnus tried to throw his opponent off guard with the move bishop c4. So, oh my goodness, so far Magnus went rook g1, then bishop g5, now bishop c4. What a weird way of developing an attack. Alright, here, Alireza, the most standard move here, of course, is going to be something like e6. You simply have to cut off that bishop on this diagonal. It is way too dangerous. However, for some reason, Alireza did not do that. Instead, g6 on the board, and this move looks very strange to me. I mean, you can just look at this bishop lining up with f7. That is going to be a huge problem throughout this entire game. Now here, Magnus queen d2, just simply developing. Long castles is likely going to be next. And here, Alireza, believe it or not, has a big choice. The most obvious move is going to be bishop g7, but I'm not convinced that is the best idea. Of course, going g6 and then e6 is not really the best idea. But it turns out black has a third option. That is the standard-looking Najdorf move, e5. Now, this looks insane. Typically, you do not want to go e5 and g6 and h5 in the Najdorf when white has bishops on g5 and c4, but here it works out. So first of all, knight b3 retreating there doesn't work very well because then b5 from black and the bishop no longer has access to the b3 square on this wonderful diagonal. For that reason, white's going to have to go knight to f3 here, and suddenly black seems to be hanging in there. For example, queen c7, bishop b3, b5, the bishop's going to go on b7, and here black seems to have an okay position with some pressure on white's center. However, rewinding a little bit, in this position on move 9, instead of that line starting with e5, here Alireza actually does go bishop g7, and this is really the start of a lot of his problems. Here Magnus says no problem, castles queenside, And now I'm ready to start an attack. Of course, the old idea of g4 isn't going to be an option, but now Magnus has a different idea. He actually simply wants to go f4, and then either e5 or in particular the move f5, trying to chop away at this weak pawn on the g6 square. Okay, those are White's ideas, but what about Black here? What the heck is Black supposed to do? Well, first of all, I gotta point out the fact that castling too early in this position is gonna be a bad move. Here, castles is simply dubious. If you're a beginner, this may seem strange. I mean, shouldn't you be trying to castle as fast as possible as White and Black? Well, it turns out here, if you castle this early with that pawn on h5 and with these powerful bishops lining up with Black's position, instead, Black actually needs to keep the king on e8 for a while, where it's going to be a little bit safer, and this move h5 in conjunction with the rook on h8, the rook is actually somewhat active on the h8 square. So instead of short castles, here Alireza Firouza demonstrates his sagacity with the key move queen to c7, lining up the queen with the bishop. Perhaps Black's going to go b5 next as well, getting counterplay on the queen side. And it turns out that is exactly what happens here. Bishop b3, then b5 from Black. The idea is to go bishop b7 next, then swing the rook over to the c8 square, and Black will start to have a little bit of activity here. Now, of course, that being said, Magnus is still dominating here. Black's overall position with this bishop on g7, the king stuck in the middle with h5, just seems a little bit suspicious to me. Now, of course, here, Magnus, he has to find a way to start the attack, and he does it, and he starts with the move rook to e1. Very, very good idea. Of course, Magnus's main idea is to go f4, then either f5 or e5. So why did he go rook to e1 first instead of f4 immediately? Well, here's why. In this position, Black can actually threaten the knight on c3 with the move b4. Now, why is this a problem? Well, it's simple. After knight d5 from White, Black can take on d5, and normally if White has a rook on the e1 square, then e takes d5 is going to be a really big threat, because then all of a sudden the rook and the bishop line up with e7. However, in this position, the rook is not on e1 yet, and that means White's best choice is to capture on d5 with the bishop. However, here, after bishop b7, Black's going to be doing somewhat okay. So rewind a little bit. If f4 is not the move, then the move is rook to e1 as played by Magnus in the game. And now the idea is if Black goes b4, you can respond knight d5, and then if knight takes d5, a recapture with the pawn, and suddenly both the bishop and the rook are going to be lining up on e7, and that is going to give Black all sorts of problems. So Magnus, brilliant move, developing the rook before the f-pawn on f4. Now here, Alireza, what is he supposed to do with all that being said? As I explained before, the best move here is going to be continuing that queenside counterplay. You need to keep the king on e8 for right now, as scary as it looks. So the best move is going to be bishop b7, and then after f4 from White, you have to play the move b4. This looks risky, but overall, Black's going to be okay by taking on d5 and then going knight to c5, challenging the bishop on the b3 square. Now, rewinding, that being said, instead of bishop b7, Alireza doesn't follow my advice here. He castles on the king side. And of course, I am not pretending to be on Alireza Firouza's level, but still, this move castles kingside here looks very suspicious to me. I mean, everything Black is doing, the weird fee and shadow in the Najdorf, the h5, this just does not add up. Now from here, Magnus, he simply continues the attack with the move f4. However, there was an even stronger idea in this position for Magnus, and this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the best move for Magnus Carlsen as White in this position. Alright, I hope you found it. If you did, kudos to you, my friend. You deserve 5 Happy Meals. The key move here for White is actually knight d5. You don't even need to wait for Black to go b4. You can just jump in with the knight immediately. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, obviously the king's no longer on the e8 square, and that means the e7 pawn is now vulnerable. Okay, what is Black supposed to do? Well, first of all, retreating the queen, trying to defend e7 is absolute suicide. Here, White has the move knight to c6, hitting the queen and hitting e7 with 2 knights. That is effectively game over. This pawn's going to fall. This pawn's going to fall. That is too much. So going back, queen d8, not a viable move. That means Black has to capture on the d5 square. But then after bishop takes, bishop b7 is nearly forced. And here, of course, that pawn on the e7 square now falls once again because the king no longer on that e8 square. So as we're seeing, there are all sorts of problems associated with castling too fast here for black, not the least committing his king, but also that e7 pawn loses a key defender. Now here, back to the game, instead of knight d5, of course, Magnus does go for the move f4, solid move here, of course, continuing the plan of either e5 or f5 in this position. Now here, what the heck is Alireza Firouza supposed to do? Magnus is ready to pounce. Literally, all of his pieces here are like perfectly developed. What's it going to be? Well, let's go through the choices. First of all, e6, believe it or not, this move is absolute suicide. Here, Magnus Carlsen can actually just sacrifice a bishop on e6. Of course, the idea is if f takes, knight takes e6, forking the rook and the queen. Oh, that is going to be just a vicious attack for Magnus. e6, no good. Of course, the typical Najdorf move here, e5 looks a little bit suspicious too. Magnus just drops back the knight to f3. And again, there's so much pressure on d6. That bishop is typically on e7 in the Najdorf, but here it's not. And again, that's going to cause massive problems for black. Okay, so e6 and e5, definitely not the moves here for black. With that in mind, what's he supposed to do? Well, the best idea is to jump out to either b6 or c5 with the knight, trying to continue developing the queen side. Now here, the best square for the knight is actually knight to b6. The idea is you want to jump into the c4 square, essentially forcing white's hand. Bishop takes c4, at which point you get rid of that very annoying bishop on b3. So for example, here, knight b6, f5, best move for Magnus, continuing the attack. Then right before f takes g6, when the pawn on f7 is pinned, of course, immediately jump in, knight to c4. Then white's hand is forced. You basically have to give up the bishop. And here, black, he's still in the game. Now, in the game, instead of knight b6, Alireza Firouza does go knight to c5. Decent idea. Again, the same idea. You need to get rid of that bishop on b3. It is just too powerful. However, here, Alireza Firouza gets a slightly weaker version of the idea with knight to b6. And here's why. Here, Magnus Carlsen, he smells blood in the water, and he immediately pounces with the move bishop takes f6. Oh, this is such a dirty move. Okay, here's why. No matter what, Magnus is going to get rid of that bishop on the g7 square. That's super important. Typically, you don't want to give up your bishop on g5 for black's knight on f6 in the Najdorf unless you have a very good reason. Either you're damaging a structure, you're gaining a tempo on something, and here it works out. For example, bishop takes. Now, no matter what black does, black is in trouble. In the game, he takes with the e-pawn, and here's why. That's probably the better move. If black took back with the bishop, then you jump in knight to d5, and once again, you're forking the queen and the bishop. Black's pawn structure is going to be shattered anyway, and he actually loses that bishop on f6 or on g7, and black's kingside is going to be so dangerous. For example, queen a7, knight takes, e takes, and look at this. Kingside is so vulnerable without that bishop. Now, instead of that, in this position, of course, Alireza simply takes with the e-pawn. He does keep that bishop alive on the g7 square. However, look at his pawn structure here. That pawn on d6, so weak. Magnus is going to follow up with f5 very soon, and black is going to be in a tremendous amount of trouble. Now here, of course, Magnus immediately jumps in with the f-pawn, f5, very good. The alternative, if you want to investigate this further, would have been knight to d5. Of course, it's always a good idea once that pawn on d6 is isolated and when you can get a tempo on the queen on c7. So, for example, queen b7, then Magnus could go f5 immediately. However, I quite like the idea of f5 first here by Magnus Carlsen. Now here in this position, Magnus does have some very dangerous threats, specifically f takes g6. Of course, that bishop on b3 does pin the pawn on f7 to the king. For example, if black didn't have a knight there, white could go f takes g6, and f takes g6 back wouldn't be possible from black. Now, of course, that knight can always take on b3 whenever it wants to. However, Alireza Firouza, sensing danger, he goes king h7 here, preemptively getting off this diagonal and defending g6 with the king, so not a bad idea at all. And of course, beyond that, there is a very devilish threat by Firouza here. Bishop h6 is possible, and of course, if he gets that move off, that would be devastating for white. The queen would be pinned to the king. Magnus would be forced, for example, if he wasted a move, h3, then bishop h6, and here Magnus would be forced to go rook to e3, giving up the rook in order to save the queen. But in any case, that is not something you want to do as white. So, of course, Magnus, after king h7, king b1 on the board, getting his king out of danger. Now with bishop h6, the queen just moves to e2 or anywhere it wants to, and white's fine. Now here, Alireza, bishop b7, just continuing development, good stuff, and Magnus jumps in with the knight, knight to d5, threatening the queen and increasing the pressure on the king side. Now real fast, I want to show you knight d5 wasn't the only idea. There is an insane attacking idea, and this is going to be a key theme throughout the game, or at least the rest of this game. That is the move g4 here. You can actually sacrifice a pawn, and here's why. Black takes, then you simply go queen g2, threatening queen takes g4, and there is very little black can do to slow down this attack. Alright, cool idea, but wasn't played in the game. Instead, knight d5, played by Magnus Carlsen. Quite a good move, probably the strongest move here in any case. Now, Alireza Firouza, sensing danger, he takes on b3. White takes back, finally getting rid of that bishop on the b3 square. But still, look at black's position. It is just a mess here. All right, now, of course, white is still threatening the queen. Here on this position, of course, white took back as black was threatening the queen with check. So a takes b3 was forced. But now black, once and for all, has to deal with this threat of knight d5. And black's position is already like code red, mission critical right here. Here's why. Almost no matter where the queen goes, black is screwed. So, for example, if you go queen d7, then the winning move is knight b6 with the fork on the rook and the queen. However, almost every other queen move also is terrible. Queen c8, knight b6, the same fork. Queen d8, then you go f takes g6, f takes, and then knight to e6 with a new fork. Oh my goodness. And finally, of course, queen b8 falls into a similar problem. You just go g4 with the insane attack on the king side. The queen is too far away from the action. So with that in mind, almost any queen move is suicide. Black simply takes on d5. Good practical decision. Now instead of taking on d5, right away, Magnus inserts the intermezzo move, f takes g6, forcing f takes back from black, and only then he takes d5. Now here we have a complete transformation of the pawn structure. Of course, there is that threat of knight e6. Black's going to respond to that. However, it's a good time to slow down and talk strategy. Here, the main difference in this position, one, is the king safety. Kings are obviously castled on opposite sides of the board, so these attacks are going to be critical. However, beyond that, there is the imbalance between the minor pieces. Here, white's knight has the incredible square e6. However, theoretically, if black gets something like f5 off and then gets pressure on this diagonal, he may have some counterattacking chances. Now in the game, black immediately goes rook to e8, defending the threat. Now Magnus knight to e6, good move, getting tempo on the queen. And now, where's the best square for the queen? Well, if it goes too far on the king side, the attack will be slowed down. If it goes too far on the queen side, white's attack will rage on. It is a very difficult balancing act. Now here, technically the best move for black is going to be queen to d7. It's in both attacking range, supporting the idea of a5, then a4, and it also defends the king side somewhat. Now, instead of queen d7, Alireza Firouza does go queen to f7 in the game. However, this move is problematic. It doesn't support the attack with a5, a4 quite enough in this position. Now here, Magnus, he finally plays the move I was waiting for. The move is g4, getting the attack going as fast as possible. Now, of course, there were other slower ways to get the attack going. For example, queen to f4, both supporting the idea of g4 and threatening d6. This was playable as well. However, I give this move g4 an exclamation point for style points. I love this from Magnus. Now here, what is black supposed to do? Well, there are two main options. First of all, letting Magnus go g takes h5 is complete suicide. You cannot let the g file open up. So it's basically you take on g4 or you go h4 trying to block the queen side. Now h4, let's look at this first. If black goes here, then Magnus simply goes queen to f4 and he has all sorts of threats on d6. There's even the idea of knight to g5. For example, if black wastes a tempo, rook to d8 trying to defend. Then knight to g5 literally wins on the spot. If black takes the knight, you take back the queen, and that is game over. So h4, very, very problematic from black. Instead of that, in the game, Alireza Firouza does take on the g4 square. However, of course, this is also problematic for black. In the game, Magnus goes rook to e4, but there's actually an even more brilliant move. That is simply h3, the double pawn sacrifice. And if black takes, you go rook to h1, you win the pawn, and the attack rages on. Now, instead of that, rook to e4 played in the game. Magnus wants to win the pawn back with the rook. Very solid idea. And now Alireza Firouza, he actually starts to get a little bit of counterplay. He realizes this diagonal here is almost never going to work out the way he wants it to. Instead, he goes bishop h6. Now, of course, real fast, the idea of f5 trying to defend the pawn on the g4 square does not work. You do not need to be a very stable chess genius like Magnus Carlsen in this game to find this move. The winning move is simply knight g5 check. Of course, you win the queen. So going back, rewinding a little bit, here, bishop h6 was the move by Alireza Firouza. Very good move. Once you realize this diagonal here is never going to work out, you have to get on this one. And now there are actually some long-term threats. For example, if black gets the move a5, then a4, and somehow opens up the a-file, having this diagonal here cut off from the king is going to be quite important. So a very, very good move from Alireza Firouza. Now Magnus obviously sensing danger. Queen to f2, getting the queen out of the attack. And here, finally, the move f5 is actually possible because now the bishop also covers the g5 square, stopping knight g5 ideas. So very, very good stuff from Alireza Firouza. However, that doesn't stop Magnus from winning the pawn on g4. Of course, here the move is rook takes g4. Now if black takes the rook, you just take the queen. That is obviously not possible. So here Magnus gets his pawn back and the game goes on. Okay, this is another very critical position for black. He has to find the best move. There are a couple of good ideas, and Alireza Firouza found one of them. The first good idea is actually sacrificing the exchange. You go rook takes e6, then gain back the pawn. And here, black, despite being down the rook for the bishop, he has quite a bit of activity. For example, this bishop still slicing down to the c1 square. And here, black has the very simple attacking idea of going a5, a4, trying to blow open the a-file and get some sort of attack going. So this idea of rook takes e6, very, very playable for black, but instead, Alireza Firouza finds an idea I like even more. That is the move queen to a7, and believe it or not, this is kind of a double attack. First of all, you have the attack on the queen, but beyond that, the rook is now hanging. Of course, back here, you could never take the rook because the queen here would be hanging. But here in this position, suddenly, both threats are happening. And here, of course, if the queens come off the board, Alireza Firouza is going to be perfectly fine. Material is even. His pawn structure really isn't that much worse than white's. And of course, that bishop could be a very powerful asset in the endgame. So here, Magnus Carlsen, he has literally one move to solve his problems and keep the attack going with the queens on the board. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to solve this one for Magnus. It's a solid one, but even if you're a beginner, you should be able to find it. Now, the key move here, of course, is rook g to d4. You defend the rook, and you block the queen. Oh, brilliant stuff. But of course, Alireza Firouza not amused. He starts his attack on the queen side with the move a5. Of course, his plan is very simple here. He wants to go a4, then take on b3, and finally deliver checkmate on the a1 square. Of course, Magnus, he's going to have something to say about it, but black's plan here is incredibly simple. Just a caveman-style attack. Now Magnus here, queen h4, good move, setting up some threats and pinning that bishop on h6. And by the way, in case you didn't notice, this is not just a pin. Magnus is actually threatening the move, queen takes h6. For example, let's say Alireza Firouza wastes a move. He goes queen to a6, just a wasted move. Then you go, boom, queen takes h6, and after king takes, that's another blunder, you go rook h4, and that is checkmate as the g7 and g5 squares are blocked off by the knight. Oh my goodness. I mean, that reminds me of a queen sacrifice Magnus Carlsen played against Ding Liren earlier this year, but that is another story for another day. Now, going back here, of course, queen takes h6 is the threat. Alireza Firouza finds it. He goes queen to e7. Now, this move defends the threat because if Magnus takes on h6, then goes rook to h4, obviously the queen covers the h4 square. So here, Alireza Firouza clearly covering everything. So instead of that, here, Magnus queen to h3 is the move. And now his threat is simply rook to h4, doubling up on this bishop on h6. All right, we know Magnus Carlsen's threat. Rook h4 is coming. What does Alireza Firouza do? Well, he plays a very curious-looking move, but it turns out to be absolutely brilliant. He goes queen to f6. What's the idea? Well, Magnus goes rook h4, as I explained. And here, what's he doing? I mean, if he wanted to go queen to queen g7 is the impossible, but what does Alireza Firouza try to do here? Well, he goes g5, And now the queen defends the bishop. Oh my goodness. Brilliant stuff. Going queen f6, setting up the indirect defense. Then going g5 with a gain of tempo on the rook. All right, Magnus Carlsen is not amused. He goes rook to h5, keeping the rook alive. However, h5 is a very weird square for the rook. It is sort of trapped here. It literally can't go anywhere right now. All right, rook h5 was the best move by Magnus, but it's not the only move. Real fast, I want to show you the alternative. Here, you can actually play rook takes h6, believe it or not. The idea is you deflect the queen away from the defense of the f5 pawn. Then you simply take it. Queen takes f5. And here you have an ongoing attack. The king is very vulnerable. Yes, you are down the exchange, but it's not like black's rook on a8 is doing a whole lot in this position. So if you're a hockey fan, it's sort of a power play position by Magnus with all sorts of dangerous threats going on. Now, back to the game, of course, rook h5 played by Magnus, the best move, but the rook is trapped. It's all very strange looking. Now, Alireza Firouza, g4 on the board. The idea is he's trying to force out queen to h4 from Magnus. Then you simply trade queens and black is doing fine. So, of course, Magnus sees that. Instead, queen d3 is the move, keeping the queens on the board. And, of course, besides just keeping the queens alive, there is a very big threat on the f5 square. Now Magnus is threatening rook takes f5, queen takes f5, and there are some hidden ideas. For example, if black simply goes rook to f8, trying to defend, you actually don't win the exchange. Instead, the best move is simply h3 here, trying to blow open the king side even further. Oh my goodness. There are so many ideas for Magnus in this position. Now, instead of rook to f8, Alireza Firouza actually defends with the king to g6. This is the best move. However, this is where things get insanely complicated. Alireza Firouza is in so much trouble, he actually has to sacrifice the queen here. Here's how it happens. Magnus rook to f1, increasing the attack. Then Alireza Firouza takes the rook on the h5 square. But that means rook takes f5 is now possible, and suddenly Alireza Firouza loses his queen. Of course, he gets two rooks for it. Magnus gets a queen and a pawn. But still, this is very dangerous for Alireza Firouza unless he can get those rooks coordinating. I quite like Magnus Carlsen's queen and knight here. All right, of course, now king h4 is literally the only move, but what? Oh my goodness, I have no words for the king here on h4. All right, now Magnus, he continues the attack. Queen to f2, giving the king a little baby check. Now king to h5 from Alireza Firouza, and h3 from Magnus, once again trying to open up just more and more diagonals to the king. Now here, obviously, things are critical for black. You cannot ignore the threats. Let's say you go a4. Well, that's going to lose on the spot. Here you have a checkmate in 2. You go queen to f5, forcing king h4. And then queen g4, checkmate. That is a chess.com puzzle-style checkmate right there. So, of course, a4 doesn't work. Instead, here, Alireza Firouza, rook to g8 is the move, trying to defend the g4 square. And Magnus obliges. H takes, followed by rook takes. And here, queen to h2, very precise move, forking the king and that pawn on the d6 square. All right, what is Alireza Firouza supposed to do? Well, it's tough. Rook h4 is what he played. Of course, that drops the d6 pawn. Now, Alireza has one chance in this game. Of course, the king is cut off on this diagonal. Rook h1 check is a threat, and he has the idea of a4. So, of course, a4 is the move here. He needs to somehow blow open the position, then deliver a checkmate. If he doesn't, he's going to be in deep trouble. All right, here, Magnus, queen e5, another baby check on the king. And here again, black has a difficult choice. Obviously, bishop g5, not possible. Then you simply checkmate black on the spot. However, if he goes king to g4, then besides attacking the king, white actually has the idea of simply pushing the pawn down the board to the d8 square, getting a second queen. So with that in mind, Alireza Firouza goes king to g6. Actually the best idea, getting the king back to his side of the board. And now here Magnus just gives a couple of checks, queen g3, then queen to f3, and then he continues with the idea of d6, threatening d7, and then d8. That would be game over if Alireza Firouza allows it. So rook a7 on the board, defending, also getting the rook out of the attack of the queen. Of course, the rook on a8 wasn't being attacked until white went d6, in case that caught you off guard there. All right, now Magnus, queen d3 check, very good move. The idea hitting the king and supporting the pawn to d7. The king moves, and then d7 on the board. Magnus willing to sacrifice the knight, because if black takes it, then he promotes to a queen on the spot. That is going to be game over. Now, instead, after d7 from Magnus, Alireza Firouza gives the check to the king on the h1 square. He's still fighting. Magnus king a2. Black takes on b3, hoping something will happen here. Obviously, Magnus has no choice but to recapture with the king because there is the double check. King takes b3. And in this position, Alireza Firouza realizes there is nothing he can do to stop d8 from Magnus. There's no checkmate idea with the rooks, and for that reason, Alireza Firouza on move 47 resigns to Magnus Carlsen. Oh my goodness, what an attacking game by Magnus today. Alright, Chess YouTube, if you enjoyed this video, please do me a favor, give the video a like, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist while you're at it, and I'll see you in the next video.